Hello and welcome. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending upon where you are. This is our third webinar on the drivers of food choice in low and middle income countries. And today we're going to be talking about changing values in food choice and the implications for demand creation in low and middle income countries. So just by way of background, this program is funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're partnering. This is a partnership between the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy and the Drivers of Food Choice program. And the purpose of the seminar, of the webinar series, has been to try to convey what we've learned and to have a discussion about the roles and implications of global food systems and globalization for agriculture and markets, food choice, nutrition and health in low and middle income countries. So we're going to organize the day by having 4 presentations. Christine Blake, who's the principal investigator for Drivers of Food Choice program, is going to give a short presentation to set the stage, and then we'll have 3 other presenters whom she'll introduce. Each of which will talk for 15 minutes. And so in about an hour, at the top of the hour, we will then have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. This is a format that's worked well, and we value your input and your suggestions. You can use the chat box to submit your questions, or we'll have an opportunity for you to ask orally. So let me turn it over to Christine.
Hi, Edward. I hope you don't mind if I could just jump in from the ANH Academy and give a few Zoom housekeeping notes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Sylvia, and I'm from the ANH Academy. And we're also really glad you've joined us today for the webinar. I won't take up too much of your time, but I just want to go over a few Zoom technical items before we get started and dive into Christine's presentation. So first of all, this webinar will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat box. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you work with. You can also rename yourself in the Zoom call with the name you'd like people to use. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Later on in the session, we'll also open up the conversation with the question and answer session after the presentations. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session. You can send your questions in at any time, and we'll do our best to raise them. If we have time, we may also ask you to raise your hand so you can ask your question using the audio function. And if at any point you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. If you get lost, please try to reconnect to the webinar using the same link. Great, that is it from me. Please go ahead, Christine. Looking forward to your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Ed. Let me just get my screen up here. Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to kick off this webinar today, our third webinar in this 4-part series, as Ed mentioned, on drivers of food choice. As a quick recap, in January, we provided an overview of how and why people make food choices in changing food environments. In February, just a couple weeks ago, we explored perspectives on food safety. And today we will look at how changing values drive food choice in different contexts. I'd also like to thank the DFC team listed here, our funders, as Ed mentioned, and the entire DFC family of grantees, technical advisors, and collaborators. So briefly, values are generalized ends with connotations of rightness, goodness, or inherent desirability. Values are important fundamental drivers of food choice that encompass the processes by which individuals and households decide what to grow, gather, purchase, or obtain, and how to acquire, store, prepare, distribute, and consume the food they eat. Values play a central role in changing food choice behaviors of those experiencing the nutrition transition. Values are understood across different levels and types. There's not just one way of thinking about values. For example, we can classify values as universal, social, or cultural, or personal. And universal values are those that are common or held by leaders so that they shape a policy environment, or they're well represented among leadership. The relative importance of these values may differ by culture and individual. For example, Kidder's universal human values of love, fairness, freedom, unity, responsibility, respect for life, to name a few, are some of the values that might be expected to be represented broadly across cultures or individuals. Where social, or sometimes called cultural, values are core principles or ideals upon which an entire community exists. Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory is a great example of an application of cultural values, where his theory is used to compare cultures of nation states using dimensions such as power distance, individualism versus collectivism. And personal values are those trans-situational desirable goals that serve as guiding principles in people's lives. We often, much of the food choice literature emphasizes personal values. For example, Schwartz's proposed personal values that are universal in content and structure. So some of those are examples of his 10 universal basic human values are self-directed thought, conformity, achievement, stimulation, that undergird our behavior and our way of thinking. But personal values in specific situations have also been identified and used to understand how beliefs and ideals are expressed in behavior, and in areas such as work, immigration, sexuality, parenting, and food choice. So food choice values specifically are situational goals that manifest as considerations to guide how and why people eat what they do. Cost, taste, convenience, health, managing relationships, among others, are commonly described across contexts and people. And when you ask somebody what's important to you when making a food choice decision, they'll often say cost or taste or convenience or health. But what does that mean in different contexts? It's those universal and cultural values that shape those considerations. So what is considered acceptable cost? What constitutes good taste? What is considered convenient? And what is good for health? And what even is health? How are we even conceptualizing health? Is it for the individual, the environment, the family, etc.? And that will vary depending on those underlying universal and cultural values that shape food choice values or considerations. So understanding how values drive food choice in rapidly changing low and middle income country contexts can provide necessary information for effective policy and program action to ensure demand for sustainable, healthy diets. The purpose of the DFC program is to facilitate, synthesize, and disseminate research to provide a deep understanding of the drivers of food choice among the poor and developing countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The DFC program included 15 projects across 10 countries. All projects incorporated understanding of values as important drivers of food choice to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the aims of the project. Some specific values that were identified through this work include those that are more cultural or social values, like patterns in meal consumption and timing, required ingredients or staples that are rooted in the cultural context, body size ideals, the meanings of animal source foods, traditional agricultural or acquisition practices, social status in food, or gender roles and agency around food. And some of the personal values of cost, health, convenience, and taste, including also snacking, personal relationships, trustworthiness, cleanliness and freshness, or child preferences, to name a few, have been explored throughout the work in this portfolio. And understanding is how value negotiations drive food choice decision-making, especially in these contexts, is important for aligning policies and interventions for the successful promotion of sustainable, healthy diets. Through a synthesis of evidence in the DFC portfolio, we examine how values drive food choice in this webinar. And today we'll have the pleasure of learning more about values, and food choice from different perspectives with 3 excellent presentations of original food choice research. We'll begin this webinar with a presentation by Dr. Valerie Flax on body size perceptions and food preferences among mothers and children in Malawi. We will then hear from Dr. Maddie DeMott about their work in India that is based in understanding of cultural meal composition patterns and values that shape trade-offs for ingredients of main dishes. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Bukachi about the cultural values that drive food choice and the value specifically of animal source foods in Kenya. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the webinar and look forward to our discussion after these presentations. And I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Valerie Flax.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think Sylvia is going to put my presentation up, so we'll wait for that to appear.
Just to jump in, for some technical issues, Sylvia is not using the Zoom at the moment, so I will share your slide. I have it ready here. Just give me a minute. But in the meantime, you can continue the introduction part, and I'll share it from my end.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm Valerie, and I'll be presenting some results from our Drivers of Food Choice study among overweight mothers and children in Malawi. So I will wait until my slides come up before I go to the next one.
Apologies for the technical issues, but I have it ready. Great.
Okay,
Perfect.
great.
Can you see the slide now?
Yes, now we can see it. Great, thank you. So can you go to the first slide? Okay, so Malawi is a country in Southeast Africa that has seasonal food insecurity and a high prevalence of stunting and undernutrition in children. However, at the same time, overweight is rapidly increasing in mothers and children in Malawi and in other sub-Saharan African countries. Here you can see the prevalence of overweight among mothers and children from the last Demographic and Health Survey, which was conducted in 2015. But a more recently published population-based survey in central Malawi showed that 44% of urban women and 27% of rural women are overweight or obese. So countries like Malawi are starting to recognize that overweight is a problem, and Malawi's last nutrition strategic plan included a target to reduce the rate of overweight among children, adolescents, and adults. However, there's a lack of evidence for developing any interventions to achieve this goal, and we're hoping that the findings from our study help to do that. Next slide, please. So we originally developed our own conceptual framework for this study, but we have since mapped it onto the Turner Food Environment Framework. I think our various variables fit actually quite well within the framework proposed. So our goal was to triangulate multiple different research methods to identify and explain how different elements within the personal domain of the food environment are related to dietary intake and food choice among overweight mothers and children. We specifically focused on the accessibility, desirability, and affordability elements of the personal domain. And here you can see the boxes highlighted in red are the aspects that I'm going to cover in this presentation, specifically measures of affordability or cost, taste preferences, and body size preferences. Next, please. So our study included mothers with children less than 5 years old in urban and rural sites across 2 districts in central Malawi. Participants were enrolled in 3 categories: overweight mothers with an overweight child, overweight mothers with a normal weight child, and normal weight mothers with an overweight child. We collected survey data from all the participants, including body size preferences, taste preferences, dietary intake, and questionnaires on socioeconomic and other characteristics. For a subset of the participants, we also collected qualitative and observation data. Next, please. So now I'm going to describe our methods for the food preference or the taste preference and the body size preference assessments. The food preference checklist included items from the Malawi food composition table, plus packaged foods that you can purchase in stores. Mothers were asked to rate how much they like or dislike each food using a 5-point hedonic scale. And we then calculated the average value for all foods within a food group for each mother. Next, please. And to assess body size preferences, we used separate sets of body silhouettes for mothers and children, repeating the process so that the mother could answer the questions first for herself and then for her child. So you can see there's 7 silhouettes for each, the mother and the child. Here you can see there's numbers below them and these sort of things above them saying underweight, normal weight, and so forth. You can see in the picture on the right side that actually in actual practice, the numbers and the text are not on the silhouettes and they're actually on separate cards, each of them individually, so that the mother can pick which one she prefers for the various questions that were asked. So first they were asked to say sorry, can you go back for a sec? First the mother was asked which silhouette most closely resembles her current body size. Then she was asked which one she would prefer to look like, or she would prefer her child to look like. And finally, she was asked which one she thinks looks like a healthy woman or a healthy child. Okay, next, please. So we then took the body size, the taste preferences, and a variety of other variables that we had decided in advance that we wanted to look at and how they relate to food choice among this population, and we put them into regression models. And this is kind of showing you the results of our main analysis. And we found in that analysis, and we looked at how that related to intake of food groups. And what we found was that taste preferences, body size preferences, and various different measures of affordability and cost were most often associated with the most food groups. So for maternal taste preferences, we found that they were positively associated with intake of grains, legumes, vegetables, grains and legumes in mothers, fish in mothers and children. Sorry, I'm mixing up. Sorry, let me say that again. Maternal taste preferences were positively associated with intake of grains, legumes, and vegetables in mothers and children, and fish and oil intake in children only. Preferences for larger body sizes were negatively associated with intake of grains and legumes in mothers, fish in mothers and children, and positively associated with intake of sweets in children. And measures of higher income or better food insecurity were positively associated with vegetable, meat, dairy, snack, and sweet intake in mothers and children, fruit intake in children, and they were also negatively associated with legumes and fruit intake in mothers. Next, please. So now I want to dive a bit more into the body size preferences and how that affects food choice. So first we looked at how mothers' actual body size. So you can see the actual body size at on the x-axis in these graphs. So that's based on their actual BMI. You can see the normal weight and overweight and obese at the bottom. And we looked at how that was related to their selected body silhouettes. For the mothers, we didn't find any difference, any significant differences by weight status in their selection of body silhouettes that represent their current, preferred, and healthy body sizes. However, you can see the white parts of the bars are their selection of an overweight or obese silhouette. So you can see, for example, in the middle 2 bars where it says preferred, the majority of the mothers preferred an overweight or obese body size. And you can see in the healthy bars on the right part that almost all of them selected an overweight or obese silhouette as being healthy. For the children, we found that a higher percentage of mothers with an overweight or obese child compared with those with a normal weight child selected a body silhouette that aligned with their child's current weight status. So the mothers who had a normal weight child, I would say about a third of them picked the correct body size for their child, whereas the other thirds either thought their child was overweight or normal weight. Whereas the ones who had an overweight child were more likely to select a correct body silhouette. Similarly, for the preferences, we see that mothers who have an overweight or obese child preferred an overweight or obese body silhouette compared to mothers with a normal weight child. And again, as with the mothers, for the children, the mothers also, by and large, said that an overweight or obese silhouette was healthy for a child. Okay, next, please. So we then looked at the difference between the women's preferred and current body size selections and how that related to their actual body size. We found that significantly more normal weight than overweight or obese mothers wanted a larger body size based on the difference between their silhouette selections for their preferred and their current sizes. And approximately 1/4 of the mothers, so that's the dark blue part of the mother's overweight bar, about 1/4 of mothers preferred a silhouette that was smaller than their current silhouette. And nearly all of those mothers were either overweight or obese, and they tended to be in urban areas and have a secondary or higher education. And then in terms of children, although you can see slightly fewer mothers of overweight or obese children preferred a larger body size for their child. However, we didn't find any significant difference based on weight of the child. Okay, next, please. This slide shows some quotes explaining mothers' body size preferences. It was generally overweight mothers or mothers of overweight children who preferred a normal weight body size, mainly because they had experienced some issues themselves or with their child related to overweight, as you can see in the quotes on the left side of the slide. Whereas the majority of mothers preferred an overweight body size because they thought it looked healthy or strong, and that you can see in the quotes on the right side of the slide. Next, please. And then after the body silhouette selections, the women were asked what types of food or drinks will help them get to or stay at their preferred body size. And here you can see in rank order from the top left to the bottom right on each half of the slide, the foods that they listed. So for the mothers on the left half of the panel, so starting from the green leafy vegetables were the top most cited food, all the way down to the meat, which was the least cited out of this list. And as you can see on the left half of the slide, there were many fewer mothers who wanted a smaller body size. They emphasized eating less oil. That's why there's a red arrow going down next to the oil bottle. Eating lemons or adding lemon juice to their food. This was really only mentioned by these overweight women who talked about wanting a smaller body size. Drinking lots of water, but they also mentioned vegetables, eating vegetables, fruits, and grains. On the right side of the panel, you can see that women who wanted a larger body size also mentioned vegetables, fruits, and grains, but in their open-ended comments, they tend to emphasize meat, dairy, and sweetened drinks. Next, please. Okay, and so then we did something similar for the children. Here you can see on the left half of the panel, it's really quite few mothers who wanted a smaller body size for their child. So we kind of need to consider that data in light of the small sample of those women. You can also see that many of the foods that were mentioned, both for child weight gain and reduction, are similar. You see on both sides, you see maize, fruits, vegetables, meat, ground nuts, and even on both sides, you see sodas or fizzy drinks. Next slide, please. But again, many of the women kind of circled back to cost. So you could see in the first slide I presented of results that cost or affordability was related to almost all the food groups that we looked at. And that kind of came out many times, both in talking about the body silhouettes and in our qualitative data. The women sort of circled back to cost. And the fact that their food choices, even though they may want to eat certain foods, their food choices are constrained by what they can afford. So they either would like to eat other types of foods to gain weight and they feel like they can't afford them, or they want to buy certain foods for their child, but they can only afford to buy them every once in a while. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, this study showed that mothers were fairly accurate at assessing their own weight, but less accurate at estimating the weight of their children. They generally preferred to have larger body sizes for the child, whereas a preference for a large body size for themselves was more common for normal weight women. Only about 1/3 of the overweight or obese women wanted a smaller body size, suggesting a gap in knowledge of the adverse health consequences of overweight or obesity in this sample. The types of food that women would like to eat or feed their child to increase weight were a mix of healthy and unhealthy foods, but cost was often cited as a challenge in purchasing them. Next, please. So what could we kind of do with these findings? These findings could contribute to plans for developing interventions for obesity prevention in Malawi to achieve the Ministry of Health's goals. For example, the selection of large or even the largest body silhouette as healthy suggests that programs could try to increase knowledge about which body sizes or silhouettes represent a healthy body size and increase awareness of negative health consequences of overweight and obesity. Double duty messages, so those are messages that can work both in context where there's both undernutrition and overnutrition. So those types of messages which describe the foods that are healthy and unhealthy for mothers and children are also needed. This is especially important as incomes increase in places like Malawi and more families are able to afford the unhealthy foods that they are currently priced out of. Next, please. So finally, I would like to thank our funders and our excellent study team, and I look forward to answering your questions after the other presentations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. So our next presentation is by Maddie DeMont.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So I will be presenting some of the research we've been doing under the Drivers of Food Choice program as a grantee. IRI was one of the grantees. So insights from India, nudging behavioral intention of food choice towards healthier diets. So 2019 was a very crucial year. The report of the Eat Lancet Commission was really influential. And so basically they were arguing that we need to achieve planetary health diets by 2050, which is very ambitious. And this will require dramatic food system transformation, which on its turn will really crucially hinge on behavioral change at multiple levels of the food system. So we were interested in taking a critical look at how income shocks and information can condition behavioral drivers of food choice. So we developed a food choice app and we applied that in Eastern India. So basically, when you look at the Eat Lancet report, some first studies came out now that looked at diets in India, and they basically concluded they're far from what a planetary health diet should look like. I mean, Indians, they consume an excess amount of cereals, not enough proteins, fruits, vegetables, and this is really a big study with 0.1 million households. So this is a kind of the conclusion. So one of the things we were interested in is we wanted to look at the food system, at behavioral change. And so we started looking at this environment. So we started looking at the interface between drivers, sociocultural drivers, food environments, consumer behavior, which then leads into diets. And this food system framework is very useful because it really puts food environments to the front. And when we looked into the literature, a very useful paper from Herford and Ahmed, they looked at the food environment and how income shocks translate into dietary quality. It's not because your income increased that necessarily your diets are going to become more healthy. because all that is, of course, conditioned by the food environment. Diets are only going to become healthier when your income increases if the food environment really encourages you to do so. So these are one of the things we looked at. And so our research question became, how does behavioral change communication, behavioral change communication is basically a way for changing values, personal values, cultural values, and income shocks. How can that affect diets in a simulated digital food environment, which is, of course, something we created by designing the Food Choice app. Basically, the Food Choice app is like a menu. You can create your own weekly menu, and the interesting thing about the Food Choice app is that it directly focuses on dishes. You can define what dishes you're going to consume during the week, when. It looks at different eating occasions. It looks at different weekdays, and this app, we calibrated that to Eastern Indian conditions. It has 155 unique dishes. There is a budget constraint, and you have to allocate your weekly food portfolio against that budget constraint. Once your budget is finished, you can no longer add any dishes, and you still need to feed your household, so you need to make trade-offs between trading off nutrition and affordability. So the interesting thing about this app is that you can do that in different rounds. So we were interested at the household level decision making. So we did the experiment. We gave the app on tablets to households, first to women and men individually. They were doing that individually, that exercise. They had to plan their weekly food budgets for their family. And then we gave them another chance to revisit that, to do the exercise again, but then as a family, by achieving consensus rounds. And this is very interesting. Not only it generates sex disaggregated data, but also you can measure intra-household decision-making power. And that's interesting in its own right. This is part, of course, of a larger, bigger picture project that looks at 3 stages. First, we started capturing food choice with experts. Then we did surveys to validate that food choice. And all that information was then converted into the Food Choice app, which was then used in a 3rd stage to try to see under what conditions can we nudge households towards healthier food choices. The entire methodology has been published in a book, an Elsevier book. So we looked at Eastern India. This is an area where IRI is very active. So this was one of our priority areas. We did the experiments with 177 households, always inviting husbands and wives in 9 urban and rural areas in West Bengal. The target population was low middle income classes. We did this experiment in 2018. And we had 2 interventions, treatments. So the first one was we gave every household a random food budget. Not just any food budget. We looked at rural and urban incomes and food budgets, and then we just randomized from those populations. We took a random budget within that rural population and within that urban. So it's a bit like shuffling food budgets. We told people, look, you're together in this room, you're different households, you're just going to shuffle each one's budgets. And then secondly, a second treatment with it is a behavioral change communication. And this is something we really approached a local celebrity, Anandita Ray. She's also part of this study, part of our project. And we asked her to create a behavioral change communication. We didn't want to influence her using local knowledge. She's a nutritionist who appears often on the television. She has local knowledge on what optimal and healthy diets are. And the only thing we asked her to do is to structure her interventions into 3 levels. Here is a representation of how we look at diets. Cultural values really shape diets. Cultures define a set of occasions during which we typically eat, breakfast, AM snacks, PM snacks, dinner, special occasions, birthdays, Christmas, holidays. And that commands on their turn a set of dishes that typically go with those occasions, differentiated or not, which define ingredients. So we just asked her to provide 3 types of behavioral change communication. The first one is the classic one. A lot of nutrition literature focuses on ingredients. They say these are healthy ingredients, these are unhealthy. And we asked her to present ingredient substitutions. What are healthy ingredients that can substitute for unhealthy ones. And then in a second treatment, he asked her to add a section on dishes. Yeah, what are healthy dishes? What are unhealthy dishes? What are healthy cooking preparation methods? What are unhealthy ones? And then finally, we asked her in a third treatment to add something on occasions, how to plan your occasions. And for instance, she told people that it's better to eat like a king in the morning, like a prince at lunch, and like a pauper at dinner. Try to shift your calories towards the morning. So this is a third level. And we wanted to see how these three levels of information affected the social and cultural values of the target population. So total data set is 529 observations. Remember, we have 177 households, and we have 3 observations by household: husband, wife, and consensus. So it's a panel data set. We have many variables that we are able to measure and calculate expenditure shares among the food groups. Since we're at IRI, of course, we're also looking at per capita rice consumption. We are very interested in that. Dietary diversity scores can be calculated. Total calorie consumption, how those calories are distributed among macronutrients, carbs, proteins, and fat. And then, and this is a bit novel, we can also see at how those calories are distributed among occasions: breakfast, snacks, lunch, dinner. And then finally, as I said before, we are able to measure women's inter-household decision-making power, since we have that two-stage approach of measuring individual food choices versus joint. Independent variables, we look at location. Kolkata is the city, so we have this urban-rural component, northern versus southern part of the region, but also timing. We look at weekend versus weekdays, and also morning, doing the experiment in the morning even. We can even measure whether just doing and asking people to plan their food choice in the morning affects their food choice. So there are many dimensions there. Treatment variables, we have the budget constraint. So by giving households a random budget, we in fact randomize a budget shock. So sometimes they receive a smaller budget what they're used to. So suddenly they're in a kind of situation in which their income has declined. Sometimes they get a higher budget, or sometimes the same. And then T1, T2, T3 are those 3 behavioral change communication treatments. We also measure their self-reported hunger levels. We ask them before doing the experiment on a scale, how hungry are you? We give them a specific scale to measure this. And then finally, we collect socioeconomic variables. Note the variables in red are all 3 types of income variables. So we're able to see the influence of artificially constraining households, but also the influence of their real food budget, what they're used to use in their households. And then finally, we also have income as a variable. So the kind of econometric models we use are, since we have proportions, in many of those cases, we use fractional regressions. We also sometimes use linear regressions, fractional regression again for women inter-household decision-making power, which is basically a ratio from 0% to 100%. And then features, this is a panel data set. We have multiple repetitions, so we use standard errors clustered at household level. We tend to be a bit conservative. We only start to look at statistical significance starting from 5% and below. We look at 5%, less than 1%, less than 0.1%. Our variance inflation factors are okay. There's not much multicollinearity going on. And we did a test of joint orthogonality showing that our randomization was acceptable. So these are the results. So all the results are summarized there, but I will zoom in a few key results. So first of all, let's look at the treatment effects. Remember first that from the Eat Lancet report and the study, they concluded that Indians consume an excess amount of cereals and not enough proteins, fruits, and vegetables. Remember that. So let's now look at the results. Let's look at the 3 treatments, the behavioral change communication treatments. We see they trigger some replacement of animal by plant proteins. That's what we see here. And carbs also towards proteins. We've seen a kind of consistent and robust effect on increasing the calorie share for proteins. However, The bad news is that we see that this is going at the expense of fruits and at the expense of dietary diversity. And this is the first time we've seen that. We've never seen anything similar in the literature. You can treat households with information, but it might come at the expense of household dietary diversity. This is an important effect we need to take into account. Now let's have a look at the artificial budget constraint. We see that budget constraints tend to, when people are more budget constrained, it tends to boost expenditure in starch, pulses, and vegetables, and reduce dietary diversity. So when you're more constrained, you tend to have a poorer diet. And it tends to increase carbs and reduce dietary fat. And it's interesting to see that when we look at real food budget, it's exactly the same. And so when we look at the higher the real food budgets that they have, the less starchy their diets become, the less pulsy, less vegetables, and the higher their household dietary diversity score. It's very interesting. So we have two ways of seeing the effect of income, artificially and real. And we see that they're exactly the mirror of each other. So it means they're exactly having the same effect, because this is a constraint and this is the real food budget. So this is very promising, meaning that our results seem to be quite consistent. This is a validity check. So the question now becomes, did our third treatment, in which we give them the full big picture of a healthy diet and also saying how to plan your diet, eat a breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper, did that really affect and cause shifts in calorie intake, planned calorie intake? We saw at some extent, yes, we see, for instance, that there is some shift from lunch to AM snacks. That's as far as they want to go. So this really shows the importance of cultural values. In Indian culture, dinner is the most important dish. So if you come with the behavioral change communication saying you need to reduce calories from dinner, it might cause some resistance. And we see here, we were not able to shift dramatically a lot of calories from dinner towards other occasions. But we see that urbanization does that. So we see that in urban areas, in Kolkata, households tend to have more of their calories during lunch and PM snacks and less at dinner. So urbanization can do that. We also see that budget constraints tend to prioritize calories from breakfast. So this is important. Let's have a look at a few gender effects. We see that men tend to prioritize starchy dishes and pulses, and also plan higher calorie consumption levels. So it looks like men are driving us away from planetary health diets, while women tend to push us towards the planetary health diets. So the next question becomes, how can we empower women more? What are the drivers that really affect intra-household decision-making power? And we measured that, and you can see it's like a three-modal distribution. Women are either not empowered at all in food choice in the household, or extremely empowered, they call the shots, or somewhere in the middle, around half. It's like perfect gender equality. We see those three groups. And when we look at the drivers, we find two drivers. Women are more empowered in household diets when they're involved in all food preparation, and also in a larger household. When we look at larger households, we see they also tend to move a bit towards those planetary health diets, spend less on starch, a bit less on dairy, and also overall lower per capita calorie levels. So, conclusion, nudging and trying to affect social and personal values, it's not straightforward. We really learned a lot from this experiment. We were successful in triggering some substitution of carbs and animal for plant proteins. However, and this was totally unexpected, this was at the expense of dietary diversity. And this is important because it means there might be a trade-off between substitution and diversification. Households may be so much focused on substituting unhealthy for healthy ingredients that they forget to diversify their diet. So this is an important thing we need to take into account. And I believe there is more research needed on this. What is the optimal messaging that can nudge consumers towards diversified planetary health diets? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maddie. Okay, so and now we'll have our last presentation that Salome will present about the work done in she and the team did in Kenya.
Thank you, Edward. I will request for the video. Thank you.
Animal source foods such as meat, milk, fish, and eggs are highly nutritious foods which are critical for the healthy development of children. Through this study, which involves nutritionists, anthropologists, and economists, we aim to understand how vulnerable households in Nairobi make decisions about whether and which of these foods to consume. The study will uncover which factors, for example, cost, nutritional value, preference, are critical to the purchase decisions of mothers.
We are interested in dietary assessment and ultimately in maternal and child nutrition in this population. We focused in the different factors that influence the consumption of animal source foods, which is a food group which is generally underrepresented in the diets of the poor households, which happen to be the most vulnerable to malnutrition. Animal source foods are all very rich in essential micronutrients such as the vitamin B12, iron, zinc, and also these micronutrients are better absorbed by the body when they come from animal source foods and from other food sources. That is why even a small amount of animal source foods in the daily diet contributes a lot to the micronutrient requirements for that person.
So my role is to investigate the role of women's bargaining power on nutritional status of women, but also of their children. So there is a lot of evidence in the literature that women who have higher bargaining power will have a better health, but also we would also observe their children to be more healthy, to have a better nutritional status, and this is what we are testing here. Oh, good boy. We have designed a new measure of women's bargaining power for this project that uses a game, an economic game that is incentivized with real money in order to measure women's bargaining power.
Holly?
The way it works is that we go to the houses of women and we see women in private, so we do a survey, and at the end of the survey we ask women to play the game. So if you are the one receiving the money, I will directly pay you at the end of the interview. If it's the husband who receives the money, we will send the money through M-Pesa. So what we do in the game, we ask women to choose between a certain amount of money for themselves or an amount of money for their husband.
Husband receives 500 shillings or you to receive 0 shillings.
My husband. And we keep increasing this amount until the women start to take the money for herself.
Would you prefer your husband to receive 500 shillings or you to receive 500 shillings?
500 shillings.
For you or for your husband?
Me.
To better design the economic game, we conducted in-depth qualitative interviews as well as focus group discussions separately with men and women. Focus group discussions were also used to inform a quantitative household survey. Using the quantitative survey tool, we gathered information from 300 coupled households with small children. We asked about their socioeconomic status, about the consumption of animal source foods by each member of the household, and how much was spent on this and other foods, the household's level of food security, including the gap between what they would like to eat and what they actually eat. We also collected data on height and weight and took blood samples to assess anemia. In addition, we surveyed the local animal source food retailers of the different households on availability, cost, and perceived quality to understand food accessibility.
Poorest households with limited resources do, of course, bear strong economic considerations when purchasing their animal source foods. Their income is a limiting factor in their consumption and in their food expenditure in general. However, there is other factors which are considered. For example, food safety is an increasing concern, and indeed, animal source foods bear the highest burden of foodborne disease, and this burden falls mostly in developing countries and in their most vulnerable populations, namely young children and pregnant women. There is also other issues such as allergies, product hygiene, or trust in the vendor that are increasingly considered.
Animal source foods are critical to nutrition, but consumption of these foods by people living in informal settlements in Nairobi and by low-income populations globally is still too low. There is need to provide these populations with better access to animal source foods and also to nutritional information that can inform their choices in order to improve nutritional status, especially for children under the age of 5, whose nutrition today will have lifelong consequences. Ultimately, through this study, we hope to improve sustainable food systems to promote better nutrition.
Thank you very much. And I will now give a brief presentation, just looking at the sociocultural aspects of the foods. Let me just organize my presentation. So basically, as I put on the presentation, I would just like to highlight that this study was looked at different aspects of the food, and there was the nutrition survey, there was the survey in relation to the qualitative and quantitative aspects. So what I want to share with us is about the qualitative aspects of the study. I hope you can now see my presentation.
Yes. Yes, you can put it on slide. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yes. So I will just pick up from the cultural perspectives. The study is set up in a multicultural setting where we find people coming in and merging. So we find emergence of cultures, and people come in with their food behaviors from different places, and they end up congregating in the informal settlements. And we find that there's a lot of borrowing and dropping of some of the food behaviors. So I will focus a lot on the food prescriptions and proscriptions as a cultural aspect that determines food choice and food consumption. So we found that the prescriptions and prescriptions were prevalent in the community, and they're exhibited in different ways. And the prescriptions are based on cultural beliefs associated with new cultural beliefs. And some of these beliefs are as a result of association with new cultures. So you find people having aspects of from a female in-depth interview. She said that one time I found my neighbor who is pregnant eating meat. I told her she was eating a lot of fatty food and it's not good. I asked her, the hospital, have not told you not to take fatty foods and that the child might be too big for you and that you should eat just a little? And another female in-depth interview also said, when I gave birth, I was told that I cannot eat fish. My husband asked the person who was cooking for me, can we buy fish? Then she said, no, fish stops the production of milk. So we see that there are a lot of beliefs that revolve around the animal source foods. And what we realize is that those, what can be eaten or what cannot be eaten, meaning the prescriptions and the prescriptions, revolve around pregnant and lactating mothers and young children. So in one of the male FGDs, one of the males said that the pregnant woman needs to eat just a little because there is a belief that the way the egg is formed or created, the child can refuse to come out of the womb. And of course, we also see the fact that they are discouraged from eating eggs because of the likelihood of the unborn child's weight being too big and therefore presenting complications in delivery. For the young children, one of the prescriptions is that they're not meant to eat eggs before they start speaking. So you find parents withholding eggs from a child because there's the belief that if a child eats chicken before they speak, they will have speech-related problems. We've talked about the fish, and of course we are seeing what happens when you eat the fish, the beliefs around that. But we also find prescriptions where there are things they say that a pregnant woman should eat or a young child should eat. For example, one of the quotes in the female FGDs, I hear that camel milk can clean the blood. For example, a pregnant woman is told to take that milk so that it can help her wash her stomach or to wash her blood. And for children, they say that a baby who is, if you have a baby who is breastfeeding, you need to drink a lot of milk so that you can produce milk. So we find there are a lot of positive aspects also behind the consumption of animal source foods, where we find milk is prescribed for strong, healthy bones. Fish is prescribed for to enhance intelligence, and also boiled beef and the soup makes for the lactating mother, it helps to make her body heal faster and also helps to provide milk for the mother. We realized also some gender aspects. Just one that I pick out is the aspect of the prioritization of children's diets. And this influences the family food behavior, where adults forego their own consumption at the expense of children. And of course, this then has negative health implications for the parents, especially the mothers, where within this quote, we see a mother saying that she would rather let her child take the soup because for her, she thinks she's already an adult and the soup will not help her in any way. So for her, she claims that when she takes soup from any of the animal meat products, she's just enjoying herself. But for the child, she feels that that is useful. So those are just examples of some of the cultural aspects that we see in this community, especially in the informal settlements, that revolve around the cultural values that determine what foods people take and what they don't take and when they take them. So for the food prescriptions and the prescriptions, we found from our study that they revolve around pregnant and lactating women and young children. But besides and also, they also revolve not just on the food, but also their modes of preparation, whether you're frying it or boiling it was also one of the aspects related to the cultural aspects. So when I connect this with the rest of the study that also brought out aspects of cost, satiety, social desirability, as religious beliefs and retailer qualities are some of the factors that influence choice of food. So what we are concluding is that these cultural aspects and cultural beliefs and values, they play a big role in food choice and consumption and need to be understood and taken into consideration in development of nutritional intervention policies and programs. We acknowledge the funders, and I also acknowledge all the rest of the team members for their participation in this work. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so we are right on time and we have about 30 minutes now for questions and comments. Some have been submitted through the chat box. You can continue to do that. If you wish to speak orally, then raise your hand or wave or send a telegram or something to get our attention. Why don't we start with some of the questions that were in the chat box, and one of them was directed to Valerie, which she answered, but just to bring it forth was about how it can be in some places normative, that small size is normative. Then another question is about that Jody Harris asked Valerie is about, maybe you can comment on this, about stigma associated with overweight or obesity, or I guess possibly being thin, and what does that mean in terms of intervention strategies to not provoke more stigma? Should we be focusing on determinants rather than those conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good question. I mean, this is a very tricky thing, and I think it is very hard to try to say you're going to promote something or the other. I guess the thing that strikes me is that the silhouettes that are selected as being healthy or considered healthy are sometimes the largest ones, which are, you know, morbidly obese. So, you know, part of it to me is how do you get in people's minds the thought of what is a healthy size, so that they're not and their body size is obviously not the only thing driving their food choices. You could see in our study, cost was a huge driver. So, you know, but I guess my thinking is having people at least understand in their minds, what is a healthy body size? A healthy body size can be a huge range and is different for different people. But if your end goal is kind of to be as big as possible, is that healthy? And is that kind of the end goal that you want to have? I mean, I would love to hear other people's thoughts. I would love to hear Salome's thoughts on this and other people's thoughts on how this kind of issue could be addressed.
Salome, do you want to comment on that, or anybody else?
Yeah, what I would say is that I think what Valerie has presented is quite real, and it happens a lot, even here in Kenya, where you find being big is, a mother would want the child to be big because that's a sign that the child is healthy. So it's about finding a way of conveying information and just presenting what the weight, because it's not just about the size, it also has to go with the height and the BMI, because sometimes you find somebody who is slim but they still have health issues. So I think it's just about finding a way of bringing out those aspects of how body weight may have an implication on health.
Okay. Another question that was directed to Valerie from Michaela Lowe. Again, Valerie answered it in the chat box, but I think there's a larger issue that Michaela's raised, which is how should we think about the interplay and the directionality of values and behaviors in terms of, in relation to, for example, body size and how we evaluate our own body size. And because theoretically, I guess they could be influencing each other in either direction.
So, I mean, are you talking about this kind of question of body dissatisfaction?
Yeah, as that's one example.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
we really didn't find a lot of that in our data. There were very few moms who, I mean, we really didn't see like moms wanting to be a lot thinner in general. Some overweight and obese mothers talked a little bit about dieting or trying to control what they were eating and wanting to lose weight, but it really wasn't the most prominent thing that came out of our data. And we didn't see any data sort of thin people saying that they were dissatisfied with their bodies.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm answering the question, Ed, but.
Yeah, well, let me ask a follow-up question that I had. When you were, I think it was near the end of your presentation, one of the conclusions, you talked about you mentioned that a third of overweight or obese women wanted a smaller body size, and interpreted that as suggesting that there were knowledge gaps about the adverse health consequences of that body size. And I was just wondering how you got to that conclusion, because how do we know that it's really a knowledge gap as opposed to some other explanation?
I mean, that's a very good point. Maybe it's not a knowledge gap, and maybe that's just their preference, and they don't want to be, wouldn't want to be a smaller size. Maybe they're happy with their body size. So I mean, your point is well taken. I think, we don't necessarily know that it's a knowledge gap. I guess you could construe it as a knowledge gap from the point of view of just the objective body size and the likelihood that you're going to have more health issues if you're overweight by a certain amount or you're obese. But I think what you're saying is true. I mean, it could just be that their perception is, I'm happy with my body size and I wouldn't want to be any smaller than I am.
Okay, so we have a hand raised from Ola Eho. Maybe go ahead and ask your question or your comment.
Thank you. I'm Oladejo Adepoju from Nigeria. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. I was really concerned with the mothers that their children that are not allowed to eat meat and fish during pregnancy because of the possible big size of the children, the unborn children. I wonder, do the children have regular or normal birth weights, or are they usually underweight at birth? Then again, I want to know the effect of behavioral communication change on the attitude of the pregnant women on issue of meat and fish consumption during pregnancy. Once again, I'm Oladejo Adepoju from University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any reactions from the speakers to the comment?
Yes, I would like to respond to the aspect on the underweight that pregnant women are not allowed to eat some of the animal source foods. This is a cultural belief, and there are various aspects that are behind those cultural beliefs. But what I would say is that even when we look at when we align the qualitative work to the nutrition surveys, we found that 18% of children from those informal settlements were stunted based on the nutrition survey. And 8% of the women had very low hemoglobins, including also 11% of children. So you see that they're not partaking of some of these may have implications. There could be some correlation between them, not the cultural beliefs and their health status. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Jody Harris and Maddie have been having an interesting exchange about the limitations of in the interpretation of dietary diversity, which I think raises a sort of broader question about not about the metrics that we use and the measures that we use and whether they're what they're telling us. And then Jennifer Nielsen raised a question about the nudge message related to occasions and trying to push more consumption to earlier part of the day, and that was accompanying the two other types of interventions. So I guess a question for Maddie in relation to that is there a risk, or did you find in your study that in encouraging people to eat earlier, that what they would do is eat more earlier, but kind of eat the same later, so actually you end up with more consumption?
Good question. I also liked the comments there from Jody. So basically, we saw that the more information layers we added, the less effects. So the first, I think, conclusion is the more information you give them, the more they're confused. So that's one lesson at least. And so the only effect we saw a shift in calories from lunches towards AM snacks. At some point also a little bit from dinner, but not too much. So we weren't too much able to really shift that entire pattern. And we believe that culturally, dinners are still seen as the most important one, and it's going to be very difficult to change that behavior. And I think that's where personal and cultural values clash. So that's a bit what we learned.
So in relation to that, I think for all three speakers, I think what the work shows is the complexity of the sort of sets and systems of values that people have, cultural, personal, etc. And we want to perhaps nudge those in certain directions to try to promote healthy foods. And as Maddie's pointing out, so maybe the more we try to do, the less we're getting done. So what are your thoughts about, given what you've learned, what are good strategies for trying to go forward?
So basically our conclusion was we need more research. One of the things we tested was we believe there are 3 layers of information, and that's something we've never seen in the literature, distinguishing between the 3 layers: ingredients, dishes, occasions. These are 3 important levels of the system of consumption. And so that is, I think, one way forward. We believe in that. But we need to learn to message that in a much simpler way, very straightforward way, that is easily understood. I think we overwhelmed maybe our subjects with too much information. So we need to do that in a very simple way. And this is a research area, I believe. We need to invest way more research on that. What is the optimal messaging? And how can we say it in very few words?
Salome, any thoughts about the seemingly large number of interesting perspectives that your respondents conveyed in the interviews, and what do you do with that information and to try to redirect, I guess, towards practices that are going to lead to healthy choices?
Yeah, so one of the things is working very closely with the community health workers, providing them the information that has come up so that even as they come up with their strategies, those strategies already have this context in mind. Because many times you'll find maybe a mother would be told, you have to do this, you have to eat these foods to enable you be strong and all that from the hospital perspective. But without that hospital having the background that these are some of the beliefs that are existing, they may not tailor their interventions to take that into consideration. So one of our recommendations is that strategies, nutrition-related interventions need to take into consideration these socio-cultural perspectives to help them tailor the interventions and align them towards more acceptance by the community. So of course, it involves also some behavior change communication, which takes time. It's not something that's only is very easy to change, but with time, given that we also see people coming from different cultures and picking up new cultures, that there's room for change for such kind of people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A question directed to Valerie that I guess I'd like to bring forward for discussion is Madia Ahmed, raised the question that perhaps mothers are using body size as a proxy or a marker for healthy, and so what are the implications of that for? Are there ways, for example, of substituting other markers that might lead to different choices and what we would like to think are healthier choices?
I mean, I think that's a really good idea because I think parents do use body size, especially for children. Parents use body size, especially weight, as a measure of healthiness. I mean, that's true everywhere in the world. It's not just in these contexts. There's lots of research that's been done in, you know, in northern countries too, that is showing the same thing. Parents have a lot of trouble telling when their kids are overweight everywhere in the world. So that's not something that's specific to Malawi at all. And I think it would be good to have some other kind of way. I don't know how you would sort of integrate that into people's thinking and culture so that they would sort of take that on, because yeah, I guess I also wanted to address in terms of adults body size and perceiving a larger body size to be healthy. I saw in the chat that somebody was mentioning the fact that that might sort of be a product of HIV in a lot of these countries. And that is, I think that's a huge factor. I've also been involved in doing a bunch of HIV related research in Malawi. And, you know, people have this, for adults, people have this thought in their mind, if you're thin, it means you're HIV positive. That's left over from 10 or 15 years ago. And, you know, how can you convince people of something that's otherwise? Maybe you cannot. But I guess also to go back for a moment to Ed's previous question, I think at least in Malawi, the nutrition messaging that's there currently is really single duty messaging. It's not double duty. It's really still focusing on, we have an undernutrition problem in our country and we're, you know, going to develop our messaging to address that. And so I do think there's kind of a need to sort of shift to kind of the dual purpose messaging, whatever form that might take, so that, you know, we're not just thinking about the fact that we have an undernutrition problem, but we have both.
Okay, thanks. Kirsty, you want to raise your question or comment?
Sorry. Thank you so much. Those are really interesting presentations. I'm actually an undergraduate student, so I'm kind of just still exploring this area, but I'm doing my final year project at uni on environmentally sustainable and healthy diets in India. And so I was really interested with, I've been looking at the planetary health diet, but also its usage in India. And I'm just wondering if anyone has thoughts on, like, do you think that using the knowledge from high income countries on saying that we need to reduce meat consumption may have negative implications in lower middle income countries where actually at the moment maybe they do need to increase it slightly, and whether in the future, as we keep saying reduce meat, whether that will kind of go into these communities more and have negative effects? I don't know, but I found it really interesting from all your talks.
So anyone want to comment on that? I mean, that's a.
I can give it a try. So yeah. I totally agree. We should really. That's why we really first need to do studies on the target population. What is the target population and the target problem that we want to tackle? Not all countries have the same problems. You have the triple burden of malnutrition. Some countries will have to prioritize the first one, chronic hunger. Other countries will have to focus more on hidden hunger. For instance, we see that hidden hunger is more prevalent in South Asia than chronic hunger, while in Africa it's the opposite. So in Africa, we have a very strong argument still for increasing cereal production, because still chronic hunger is dwarfing hidden hunger levels in many countries. But this is changing soon. So I totally agree. And I think we need to look at the context. What is the problem? What is the target population? And then derive our nutrition strategy, not just take a boiler template and apply it from the West to any developing country. So I agree.
Any other thoughts about that?
I totally agree with Matti that interventions or programs need to take into consideration the social, cultural, economic, and political contexts in which they're being subscribed. And so within the African context, there's still the need for the animal source foods, but there's also increasingly the promotion of the vegetable, plant-based proteins given also the costs. So, yeah, over to you.
Yeah. It strikes me that the question that Kirsty's asked is really important because, I mean, Maddie was commenting before about how giving people too much information, too many messages just gets people confused. And I think as sort of globalization movement continues, we're going to, people in Africa and Asia are going to be hearing more messages, not fewer messages, as companies vie for getting products into markets, et cetera. Okay, any other comments or questions from folks? Okay, Sonali, sorry, Sonali. Has raised his or her hand.
Hi, yeah, thank you
Yes.
for unmuting me and the lovely presentations. Just a quick question for Maddie. Very interesting work. Just was curious if you looked at your responses by caste and class dynamics in West Bengal and the implications for, impact of the interventions, which you did.
So we captured those dimensions, but we didn't bring them out. We were always a bit reluctant to really bring that out explicitly because of sensitivity issues. So we are working with our Indian counterparts, and they recommended us not to focus too much on that. But our data enables to see those effects. We see effects of religion, we see effects of caste, but we didn't bring them out because of sensitivity issues. Yeah.
Yeah, because the reason I raised this question is, obviously these things do influence food patterns a lot in India, and growing up in India, I definitely found it really fascinating how, people from certain castes who I knew who wanted to eat meat but were not allowed to eat meat would sneak in my house and have it and whatever. And I mean, obviously these are anecdotal experiences, but it just makes me realize that, we do need to take these things into consideration. I completely understand the sensitivities involved, but in terms of being able to have an impact, I think, these are some things probably you do need to bear in mind because they are very deeply culturally rooted in we won't necessarily call it caste system in a way, but they almost are practices linked to that and ingrained in that. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Hey, great, thank you. So a couple more hands up. Gurma, I don't know how to pronounce so well, sorry. You're still muted. There you go.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for just your nice presentation, everyone. Simply to express my just appreciation to you. I think it's incredible. Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Express.
Oops. Okay, I think we lost him. Aladejo, you had your hand up also? Okay, maybe that was from before. Okay.
Hello.
Yes. Yep, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Once again, it's Dr. Oladejo Adepoju from the Department of Human Nutrition, University of Ibadan. I just want to make a quick comment and suggestion. We can food, especially on dry choices. Therefore, whenever we are planning intervention programs, we should bear in mind the sociocultural behavior of those people. And it has been found that in nutrition, the last aspect of change that we have is the cultural aspect of food. The cultural aspect of food is very difficult to change. Therefore, whatever intervention programs we are planning to improve the nutritional status and nutrient intake of people should bear in mind the background, the cultural background of those individuals, and how they can make good use of their, how we can make good use of their nutrition, the food environment, the food that is prevailing in that environment, how they can make good use of it through dietary diversification to combine them together to be able to meet their nutrient need. I think that will give us a better choice. And for whatever superstition and cultural taboos that may not be appropriate, those ones we can design behavior change, letting them know from scientific background and what has been proved that they need to change. It is only then when we plan along their culture that the behavioral communication change can easily be effected. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your comment. So we have a couple more minutes left. Sonali, did you want to comment? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just took this opportunity because I didn't see any other raised hands, but happy to back off if somebody else has a question. I had a quick question for Salome and anybody who is working in maternal and child health specifically, which is what I'm doing in Côte d'Ivoire, looking at promoting complementary feeding and exclusive feeding among caretakers. And one of the things that Salome mentioned about not giving eggs to the children is something which we also found in Côte d'Ivoire, and would like to know a little bit more about, what's the driving factor for this belief, if there is any understanding of that. And secondly, maybe a little bit understanding about the role of water in terms of children under 6, and if you have any insights into that, because obviously diarrhea is quite high in some of these countries, and we are promoting exclusive breastfeeding, but it seems to be a challenge due to various social-cultural perceptions.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Salome, do you want to comment?
Thank you, Sonali, for your comment. And yes, in terms of complementary feeding, one of the things you realize is that in the informal settlements, these are people who are of low socioeconomic income, and many of them depend on day-to-day wage to be able to sustain their families. So you find that there is the exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. For some of these people, that's a luxury. And so they have to start weaning the children at a very young age and introducing foods, other foods, to just help when the child is at home and the mother has gone to fend for something. They have to have something that the child can eat. And so you find that children are weaned at a very young age, and other foods are introduced at that young age. And of course, that then has dynamics, because what are the children being fed? What can the mother afford to be able to give the child? Of course, a lot of this relates to processed milk, or they have options between the processed milk or the fresh milk. And we know, again, linking it to your aspect on the role of water and sanitation, the handling and the hygiene also are issues. Because one of the things we found out was also, there was a lot about food safety concerns among the community. And this related to milk, and it also related to the meat products. And some of them relate to just the hygiene of how these foods are handled, what is put in that milk, what is added on, and how also the containers for handling the milk. So there's a lot of that linkage between water-related, wash-related practices in relation to hygiene and weaning of young children. Yeah,
okay,
that's
great.
my comment.
Thank you very much. So we're at time, so we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank our presenters for the great presentations and all of you for participating. Thanks to Abel and Sylvia from ANH and Emma and Shiva from Drivers of Food Choice for helping to organize all of this. And we'll look forward to seeing you in our next webinar in April, the date of which I forgot, 13th, I think, the 4th in the series, which will be held at the same time. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the week.